This afternoon I'm going to be doing a presentation on, it's actually an excerpt. We'll do first of a couple of these from the JLC Field Guide. This one is on flashing details. What I've done is I've taken kind of a cross-section of some of the details that are represented in the Field Guide. And these are problem areas that we've seen over the years. So what we're going to try and do is give you guys some information on how to properly address a couple of the areas in question. We're going to start out with a ledger flashing. We see this done improperly in a lot of cases in Chicago. Very often, the contractor will take the flashing and put it directly on top of the weather barrier. There are a couple of best practices I want to talk about. The first is integrating the flashing into the weather barrier, which I'll do. It's critical that everything that we install be installed in a shingle style or an overlap fashion. You'll see me do that, and I'll try and reinforce this as I go on. The other thing that we try to do within our company is we try to keep everything that comes in contact with the building spaced away from the building to promote airflow. Be it a deck ledger, be it any type of trim. If you can space your material, your finished material away from the building and promote airflow in back of it, your details will last a heck of a lot longer. Here's how we do it. We start with our deck ledger, and we'll actually attach strips of treated material to the backside. There are manufacturers out there that actually make specific spacers. You need to be a little careful when you attach these spacers, because if it's a structural rated application, this spacer comes into that category. You need to make sure that that spacer is bolted securely to the wall and into the framing. So if there's any lateral load, moment load on this, and the spacer fails, you need to have something beyond that. So the spacer's only for the purposes of keeping the material off the building. It is not a structural piece. Most often, if we install a deck, we'll come up to a house that already has some type of weather barrier on it. House wrap. We see a lot of felt paper in our area, rosin paper, whatever it might be. And rather than just installing on top of that, we like to reinforce in back of the ledger. And the way we do it is we actually will cut a portion of that paper away. And we'll get rid of it down to the sheathing. The reason for this is that in the event that water does get in the back of this, despite all our best efforts, I want something more substantial than just a single layer of house wrap or felt paper on the wall. I want something much more durable. So we use a rubber membrane. And there are all kinds of different manufacturers, but if you can use a rubber membrane, a peel and stick membrane, this will stick tenaciously to the wall. And I want to get it up. This is going to require a couple of hands. No, I got it. Thank you. I want to get it up under the weather barrier and bring it down onto the sheathing. Okay. Thanks, Don. Bring it down onto the sheathing, press it in place, and bring the weather barrier back down on top of it. I want a couple-inch overlap minimum. To me, this is really the last line of defense. If water doesn't make it past your flashing, you got nothing stopping it other than whatever you've installed on that wall. So I don't mind spending a few extra dollars, and I'll actually upsell my customers to do this if I have to use some type of bulletproof material. This is perfectly acceptable for most applications. If we get involved in stucco or something like that, we'll sometimes use copper. Nonetheless, this is perfectly serviceable here. Our deck ledger is going to go directly on top of that, and we're going to secure the ledger. And this is Hollywood for today, guys, just so you know. I'm using drywall screws just to tack this in place. I hope no one actually does that. All right. The next step is to take our formed flashing. And we make all our own flashings, or we sub them out. There are flashings that are available store-bought. You can go to many box stores or lumber yards, and they'll actually have deck ledger flashing. The problem is it's only about 1.5 inches or 1 5/8 inch projection or kick, and once you put those spacers in back of it, it's not going to fit. So we make our own flashings. The other reason we do it is it gives us a choice of material. We can make it out of any material we want. This happens to be aluminum. In reality, I probably wouldn't actually use this in a deck ledger application. I'd probably go to PVC coil stock, something that's UV resistant, or in many cases, we just go to copper automatically. Again, it's that upsell. It's a little bit more money, but not dramatically more. I mean, we tell people copper, and sometimes they cringe, and oh my, what kind of cost is that? It's not that much more, you'd be surprised. Nonetheless, the principles are the same. We form this on our brake. We carry a brake with us, we have a brake in the shop. We choose to do this just, as I said, so we have control and flexibility over the materials that we install. We'll install the flashing directly over the deck ledger, and let me see if I can get that tacked in there. It's important to use some of the same fasteners that you used on the material for the flashing for the nails. Now, PVC coil stock, obviously, you can use anything you want. But if this were copper, we would use copper nails or stainless steel nails. Aluminum, use aluminum nails. The issue that I have is that we've seen too many aluminum to pressure-treated failures. Pressure-treated lumber used to have a really, really high copper content. It used to be ACQ, right? Alkaline cationic quartz. It would actually eat, the copper in that material would actually eat the aluminum flashing that came in contact with it. So one way around that, now let me back up. The formulation these days is a little bit different, but there's still a bit of copper in there and I'm still concerned about it. So one way around that, to avoid this aluminum to pressure-treated wood contact, is to put yet another piece of this peel and stick membrane on top of that deck ledger, just as an isolation membrane. After that's in, we'll go so far as to put another layer of peel and stick on top of the flashing itself, and then we'll bring our weather barrier back down. So we've got multiple lines of defense, and you're gonna see a pattern emerging here with all these flashing details that I do. There will be multiple lines of defense. We don't generally see failures when we go to these extreme measures. It probably does sound extreme, but your reputation rests on it, and the safety of your customers rests on it. So I'm a real proponent of taking the extra time to take these steps and spend a bit of extra time on the details and really get it right. We do the same thing that we did here with any horizontal projection, as I mentioned earlier. Windows, particularly windows, whatever it might be. It's cheap insurance in the scheme of things. The next issue that we've encountered over the years, we don't see a lot of it because we don't really see that many cantilevers in the Chicago area, but a cantilevered beam or a deck joist. The details that I've seen have been a heavy reliance on sealants. And there's a place for sealants, but I don't want to rely on them exclusively to flash this. I'd prefer to have some metal in back of it. There's a really interesting illustration here. You can see that it really is a simple flashing detail. It consists of two pieces of material. And there's a little bit of folding and hemming involved, but it's really not unmanageable. When it's all said and done, you'll end up with two pieces of flashing just like this. And remember, I've been talking about shingle style. I started talking about shingle style overlaps. This is the same thing with this deck ledger. Let's get into this. Excuse me, with this cantilever. This is how this flashing detail comes together. What we'll do is we'll actually leave any weather barrier that's in place in back of the first piece of flashing. We'll then take the succeeding piece and we'll install it shingle style, as I mentioned. And what you want to do when you're flashing this is you want to make sure you've got some room around the perimeter of this cantilever. You need some room to slip the legs of the flashing in. I'll show you how I make this. Let me see if I can get this out of the way momentarily. I've got a couple of pieces I've already laid out just for time's sake. And what we're aiming for is we want 6 inches of material on either side of that cantilever. If you look at my layout, I've got 6 inches off this side to the dashed line. I cut this piece a little bit long. I don't really care what the length is on this side. I just want a minimum of 6 on the one side. If this is long, it's fine. If it's shorter, we've got issues. But I cut this piece overall about 15. So I took the dimensions of 6 times 2, and I added several inches to it. I came over 6 inches, I marked a dashed line. That'll be a fold or a hem. I came back over another ½ inch, and that's actually going to be my cut line. I came back over 1 5/8 inches from my dash line, which, remember, that's going to be my fold. That's going to be the side of my cantilever, and I measured over about 1 5/8 inches. Most treated lumber that I've encountered is a strong 1.5 inches. You guys run into that too? It's maybe 1 9/16 inches. I came over 1 5/8 inches. This sounds more confusing than it really is. But the first time I did this, I made a mistake and I cut this, and I ended up with an opening that was over 2 inches wide. So lay it out, double check it, and go from there. The solid lines are what I'm cutting. I'm going to cut all the way down, and I'll get rid of the middle section. And I'll nip this off right at that dash line. That'll fold into the bottom. And then I've got to get into this lower area. Fold that out of the way. Come over on that side. And we'll come on this side and cut over 1/2 inch. You'll see the reason for that in a minute. All right, here's what I've got. Doesn't look like it's wide enough to fit over that joist, right? We're gonna fold this. This is a simple sheet metal folding tool. Almost all the HVAC guys that I know use these things. They're available in different lengths. We keep a variety of these in our truck because we're often running into situations where we've got to form sheet metal in very precise increments. This one happens to be a 3/8 set up for a 3/8 inch leg. This allows us having to try and fit this into a break, which would be impossible. And it allows us to get into some pretty tight spots. Again, I'm doing this backwards, so just bear with me. That'll give you a really nice, clean, crisp fold. That's how you make this. You need 2 of these. You need one for the top, you need one for the bottom. And the way that I figure the depth of the notch is I take about 3/4 of the overall height of that cantilever. So if that joist in this case was 7 inches, 7.5 inches, I rounded it to 5. And that was my notch. And I know that if I do that, I've got plenty of overlap when I go to install the flashing. You can see it in here. I've got about 2.5 inches or so of overlap. You need that as a minimum. And again, everything is overlapped in a shingle style fashion. You guys are going to be tired of hearing me say this, but you'd be amazed at how many reverse laps I see in weather barriers and flashings. It's incredible. I will lay it on the weather barrier on the bottom. I'll lay it over the weather barrier on the top. I'll cut the weather barrier at the very top and bring it back down over the top. I will not tape this to the weather barrier. I don't tape anything to weather barriers. If you've got to tape something to a weather barrier, it probably means you should have slit the weather barrier and slid it underneath. Don't rely just on tape to seal the weather barrier. I'll use tape, don't get me wrong. I'll use it in certain applications, but I won't rely on it. I shouldn't say I don't tape anything. I won't rely on it. What I'll do in that situation is, if this weather barrier continued up the wall, it would come across like so, and I'd bring it over. I would do the same thing that I did with the deck ledger. I'd slit the very top and slip it under there. And I'd tape it to the sheathing, bring the weather barrier back down, and if you want, tape the weather barrier to the flashing. There's one more little piece that I want to show. We'll seal the top edge. To me, the bottom edge is even more vulnerable. We'll take a little piece of material and slip it on the underside and seal that as well, shingle style again. No matter what you do, a cantilever is going to rely on a certain amount of sealant. There's no getting away from it. But this at least is going to give you some protection around the perimeter. It's going to give you far more protection than just a simple bead of caulk. You do need to leave a little bit of room around the perimeter. You need to be able to get the flashing in there. You need to be able to seal it. And that's another reason that you need to keep in mind the air barrier element of a weather barrier. So You don't want air whistling in between those cantilevers.